Olá, boa tarde, bem-vindos. Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to the second session of Common Field, a 3-year international conference cycle co-produced by CCB, Garagem Sul and Lisbon Architecture Trienal. My name is Diana Menino, I'm a Portuguese architect, co-curator of Common Field, along with the Chilean architect Felipe de Ferrari. Common Field understands that architecture must be understood as a strategic attitude regarding space and resources. The conference program aims to discuss architecture in its most literal meaning, a collective knowledge that is and could be applied by everyone in any community, environment, or culture, through a series of mechanisms, devices, structures, and forms. We claim for both critical and optimistic attitudes towards contexts, policies, briefs, and clients. Architecture can appropriate reality in radical and unexpected ways, from research to construction. Making visible its potential and contradictions, and also developing projects that enable emancipatory ideas, we are able to build a common field. So in that sense, we start this cycle in October with 2 women with very interesting practices. From London, we have Jane Hall from the collective Assemble, and from Switzerland, Barbara Busser from Bauburu In Situ. Both guests presented a set of cases that allowed us to make an excellent framework on topics such as recycling and upcycling, or reuse and cooperation. So, well, now I'm going to give the word to Felipe, that will introduce you the session of today and our guests. Thank you and enjoy it.
Welcome everyone to the second event of Campo Comum series. We are happy to meet today to talk about good life, alternative models of collective housing, and the potential of an architecture without a status. It's a pleasure for us to have both Martino Tattara, co-founder of Brussels-based practice Dogma, and Roger Tudó, founding member of Catalan studio Harquitectes. I personally know them and have been following their work since several years ago. And as Greek architect Elias Engelis one referred to Dogma as harbingers of the future, I think this is a definition that match both attitude and production by architects as well. Both Martino and Roger will introduce how their practices are both reflecting and challenging cultural and material standards, offering alternatives and straightforward models that can be enjoyed by the collective in different scales. This time, we would like to take advantage of their experience dealing with housing and domestic environments. We have the intuition that the agendas by both practices are totally complementary and in tune with the main challenge of our times: the huge affordable housing deficit, the need for the collective, and an ecological crisis we are facing as a consequence of neoliberal global culture during the last decades. So I will introduce Martino. Martino Tattara is co-founder of the Brussels-based architecture office Dogma, along with Pier Vittorio Aureli back in 2002 in Rotterdam. After graduating from the Università Istituto di Venezia, he obtained a postgraduate diploma at the Verlage Institute in Rotterdam and a PhD at Venezia as well, with a thesis on Lucio Costa's project for Brasilia. His theoretical and design work focus on the relationship between architecture and large-scale urban design, and he has widely published and lectured on topics related to the city and the condition of living together. He's assistant professor of the Faculty of Architecture at KU Leuven. So, welcome, Martino.
Felipe. I'll go immediately to my presentation of tonight. Thank you, of course, also to Diana and to the Lisbon Triennial for the invitation. and especially for having placed or for having thought of placing our work in a dialogue with Harquitectes, which is a practice I have much admiration of since actually a very, very long time. Needless to say that I would have much loved to be in Lisbon with you tonight, but for the time being, let's try to enjoy in this remote format. What I'm trying to present you tonight is the result of a design-based research trajectory, which is a long project that we carried out at Dogma in collaboration with a new academy, which is an architecture collective based in Helsinki. A project that has been presented at the Seoul Architectural Biennales, of which you can now see a couple of images. This was 12 months ago, but in fact it feels more like a century ago. A project that represents an additional step within a longer work carried out at our office during the last years that try to understand and address domestic space and its possible reform, imagining the house as a place for a new collective dimension. As declared by the title of the lecture, this project is an attempt to deconstruct what we can call the affordable housing complex, trying to tackle three fundamental passages in the production of domestic space. Three passages that are often addressed as let's say, separated, and which are often not recognized as a complementary part of what should perhaps be a singular approach to the design of domestic space and I would say especially of affordable housing. And these three fundamental passages are what you can see in the slide: land property and home ownership, the issue of construction, and the issue of typology. In the presentation tonight, I would like to extremely briefly, let's say, explain the reason of each of these themes or passages, and then present to you a couple of proposals developed for the city of Brussels and for the city of London, and therefore possibly let the design work speak about each of these themes. But let me start by saying that when we talk about the current housing crisis, it is very common today to, let's say, refer to problems such as the shortage of social housing unit, more generally of affordable housing. We often talk about the long waiting list that one has to go through to assess a social dwelling unit. We often talk about skyrocketing prices of residential real estate in especially our cities. And while we keep on hearing all these, the critical question that we often forget to ask ourselves is what is actually the very origin of this crisis and what actually has brought us into this condition. And the origin of the contemporary housing crisis is first and foremost the result of the very long and controversial process of privatization of land, to the point that I would say that it's impossible to speak or to tackle the problem of housing affordability without actually starting to address the issue of access to land, which is unfortunately something that is often ignored within the realm of architecture and something that is eventually left in the hand of a collective or a social initiative. Of course, I don't want to sort of summarize here what this is about. It's an historical process that started in the 15th century, which at the beginning concerned especially agricultural land, but that in fact with the advent of industrialization became a very fertile ground for landowners to start speculating on land for housing and causing what in fact we keep on calling the housing crisis. There have been, of course, several attempts in history to face this process, such as the purchase of land by state in order to promote public housing programs or social housing programs. But in fact, we also have to admit that even social housing units that were built in the heyday of the welfare state with, let's say, a certain rigidity of typologies, the famous 3 rooms apartment, which target especially the nuclear family, somehow promoted among dwellers the idea and the culture of, in a way, or an aspiration towards a privately owned domestic space. And if the state and the market have failed to, in a way, deliver affordable houses, there are several initiatives that try to, let's say, bypass such problems, such as housing cooperative, the community land trust, which I will address in the project that I will present tonight, or, for example, the German Miethauser Syndicate, a sort of a model of public ownership of residential building within which we have tried to, let's say, work in the past. But in fact, the question that became crucial for us is, let's say, to try to establish a meaningful relationship between, let's say, such alternative, what we could call alternative ownership model and architecture, and to, let's say, engage with each of these models as an architect. The second passage of theme that I'd like to introduce is the issue of constructions. And in a way, while construction in the wider architectural culture has often been associated with the theme or the issue of, let's say, tectonic expression, it is time to readdress construction as, in a way, one of the critical component of this affordable housing complex. And we try to understand construction in terms of, first of all, labor with all its interrelated political dimensions, labor as the potential appropriation that future inhabitants could have of their living spaces, labor as the possibility of facilitating transformation and adaptation over time, but also, let's say, understanding construction as a potentially social and collective practice. And to do that, it is, let's say, first of all, also important to understand what the construction industry has become and the transformation it went through the last decade, and to, let's say, see that, in a way, technological advancement, which we tend to always see as something positive, are not always indicator of progress, since, in fact, for a very, let's say, form of progress of processes of transformation in construction could also mean, for example, the increase monopolization of, let's say, the building process in the hand of fewer players, but also, let's say, a process of the skill at the expenses of worker with the goal of reducing construction cost. And to tackle that, we start to become interested in, let's say, the possibility of producing an architecture which, in fact, would be able to rely on labor-intensive activities. For example, by resurrecting building techniques and architectural expression that are today, let's say, within, let's say, the current market condition considered generally unsustainable. And the third passage I'd like to, let's say, very briefly mention before jumping into the design work is the theme of typology, which is an issue or a theme which has been, let's say, quite central to our, let's say, design, but also research work during the last years. I would like just to say that if, let's say, many believe that the way in which, let's say, we live today, or the way in which, let's say, older generation have lived during the past decades in terms of housing typology corresponds to somehow the history of domestic space, this is clearly absolutely not true. Since, in fact, the history of the home, or what we could call the history of domestic space, is characterized by a wide range of typologies or alternative typologies, what we would call today, that challenge the idea of the home as the place of a family dwelling. And just to make a few examples, I'm thinking of, for example, housing for workers, such as lodging houses and boarding houses, which were quite widespread in the city of the 19th century. The residential hotel in all its declensions, but also communal houses that were developed in, let's say, very different part of the world. To the point that, in fact, just to make an example, in 1924, it was quite normal to imagine that an entire city, as the famous proposal by Hilbert-Seymour for the vertical city, could in fact not be made of traditional home, but could be actually based on a simple typology, which was the hotel rooms, where in fact hotel living was, let's say, not seen as something exceptional, but actually something which was the norm. But all this typological experimentation stopped from the 30s onward, when alternative typologies started to be harshly criticized, and the nuclear family became really the cornerstone of the idea of society, to the point that even in this, let's say, futuristic project of the Smithsonian of 1956, in spite of, let's say, a futuristic architecture, in fact, it's a simple single-family home where, in fact, the, let's say, gender role within the house was understood, let's say, very traditionally, as we can see in this image. So these three, let's say, themes are, in a way, what were at stake in the project that I'm going to present you. The first one is a proposal that we developed for and in collaboration with the Community Land Trust in Brussels, which is an organization that tried to promote the separation of land property from a building property, and therefore try to offer units with long-term ground leases to residents, and therefore at lower prices. It's an organization which is, let's say, starting its activity in Brussels, in Belgium, which is heavily relying so far on public subsidies, and therefore actually mostly addressing low-income population. One of the problems that they are facing is that because of this public support, they have to comply within the regulation of social housing, which translates in the impossibility of experimenting on, let's say, in terms of construction of housing, and especially in a sort of typological advancement. And which somehow also represented contradictions, in the sense that there is in let's say the few projects that were developed so far, a sort of disconnection between let's say the architecture that they are able to produce, and in a way the model of communal ownership that in fact characterize this initiative. And contrary, let's say, to this, we start working together with the idea of exploring and, let's say, expanding this idea of, let's say, collective dimension from only the possibility of, let's say, owning collectively land into something that could permeate the organization of the home. We try to explore the idea of a home that could evolve, so that could, let's say, transform itself following the changing demographic condition of its inhabitants. But we also been asked and decided to try to develop a project or a model that would be based on, let's say, a rethinking of the idea of construction, especially in the possibility of tackling the theme of maintenance, of transformation and adaptability, as I just mentioned, especially considering that, let's say, the inhabitants, which are mostly large migrant families, have, let's say, limited access to capital, but have the possibility to provide for, let's say, some workforce. We started this project by looking for potential sites, since we didn't have actually a site. And it was actually something which was not so easy, because in Brussels there is not a sort of cadastre of, let's say, public land, which is, let's say, publicly accessible. But let's say, next to the idea of the goal of finding a site where, let's say, this new housing model could be developed, it was also interesting to understand what were the characteristics of the site that we could have, let's say, met within the city. And especially it became important for us to understand, since in fact we didn't have, let's say, a specific plot to work with, whether it was possible to understand or whether, you know, this site of the city would in a way share some, let's say, common features. And among the plot that we have, let's say, found and mapped, where we have actually selected 2 of them to work with. And although they all, let's say, seems quite different from each other, in fact, they all, let's say, share one, let's say, a characteristic, which is in fact the fact that they are all somehow reducible to a basic module, which is in fact the module of a terrace house, which is the main typology through which the city has been built. And it's interesting that the type of the terrace house is a typology that in a way especially really embodied the idea of a private property, which is expressed by the principle of the party wall, which is you know, the side wall, blind wall that also perform as a load-bearing structure of the home, but it cannot in fact be perforated, so which is also somehow the property limit of each home. And the typology, which is, let's say, beside this, let's say, blind wall, is characterized by simple facade, which is built upon the repetition of, let's say, a few decorative elements. But given, let's say, the specific background of this typology, it was, in fact, particularly interesting to reappropriate it and to transforming it into, let's say, something completely different. So this, what you see in this slide, is, let's say, a typical plot, which has, let's say, 2 short sides, one facing the street and one generally facing the back garden, and what normally would become, let's say, the 2 longer blind walls of a terrace house. The idea of the project started by placing or trying to shrink all, let's say, the facility of the home into, let's say, one element, which is what we call the service structural core, that was meant to be placed perpendicular to the street and in a way subdividing somehow the plot into 2 halves. The structural service core contain possibly toilet, bathroom, kitchen, and storage space, next to, of course, perform as, let's say, structural element of the home. Of course, by placing everything, all the services into this element, we were able to define a certain or identify a certain amount of living space, which is completely undefined, a space which is not which is a room, but at the same time is also not a room, which in fact has a minimum dimension, which is 3 meters, but that in fact, in reality, would rarely be that small, considering the average size or width of a plot that are available in the city. This element can, let's say, be allow actually the space to be freely used, since in fact the space which is identified by this element is not affected by installation or structural component, and therefore can be easily subdivided by partition that clearly have no structural meaning, allowing for, in a way, the separation of the living space in rooms, the size of which can be freely determined by the inhabitants according to their need. And the same logic is, let's say, applicable to, let's say, size of, let's say, different shapes of different size, but also to, in fact, a larger plot that, in fact, are not anything else than the aggregation of, in a way, many plot placed next to each other, as in fact placing many a terrace house next to each other would have been. Devising in this way potentially different typologies of living unit, each characterized by different let's say surfaces and potentially a very different number of rooms, ranging from between the one-room apartment of let's say 27 square meter, what you see on the left side of the slide, to in fact the larger living space with 4 rooms apartment of 76 square meter. A model that would also, let's say, be able to conform in terms of width, but also in terms of depth to the different size of plot that could potentially be found in the city. So having explained the logics of the model, I'd like to show a couple of scenarios. Here you see a sort of render image of the structural core, which contains, as mentioned before, the storage, the bathroom, the kitchen, a passage, and a technical shaft that can support a larger living unit, in this case with, let's say, 2 of these longer rooms, which total to about 80 square meter. But which can become a unit for, let's say, 3 person with 2 traditional sleeping room, which can be achieved through simple partition. But in fact, with the same amount of square meter, we could easily accommodate 4 persons, with 2 of them sleeping in a traditional master bedroom, what you see in the lower part, the right lower part, and with our bed contained in what we call a small alcove, in which somehow the space of the bed becomes a room in itself, which is contained within a larger domestic space. And this is something, it's somehow a theme that interested us a lot, because in fact it, although it might seem something very simple, but somehow it allows us to rethink what a sleeping room is. It somehow allows us to bypass the current regulations, which suggest that sleeping room need to have 9 square meter, despite the fact that in many cases the bedroom is one of the least used space of the home. By doing that, of course, we, and actually you see here another of these, let's say, larger bed alcove, in this case with a larger bed. It allows actually to, in a way, make the rooms where these spaces contain more flexible, something that can be used for certainly sleeping activities, but that during other moment of the day can be used for, let's say, other activities. Larger unit could also be built along 3 cars with 4 linear rooms, with the idea that larger unit can or could in the future be further subdivided into, for example, 2 independent units, where small unit, what you have now on the right side, could be, for example, used to accommodate a son or a daughter when he or she would grow older, or even further subdividing 3 units where parents would retain only a fraction of the initial homes, and the kid would be given each an independent unit where to live independently. We had, of course, tried to think about the theme of construction, and we have adopted a technology which is based on a cross-laminated timber, which allow actually construction to proceed very quickly. It's a material which is generally more expensive than, let's say, concrete or masonry, but that in fact, because of the speed with which it can be built up, it allows also reduction of, let's say, a workforce cost. But what interests us the most is that it's a material that it's ready to, let's say, be inhabited, and especially where the use of timber facilitate the possibility of appropriation by the inhabitants, of being completed and, let's say, modified, but also another important aspect, also allow, for example, the possibility of eliminating the traditional domestic finishing, and especially, I would say, the impact that finishing have on, let's say, the cost of houses. Technical section detail. But the choices of let's say, timber and cross-laminated timber especially was in fact motivated by the possibility of, let's say, appropriation and transformation by the inhabitants themselves, which translated in the idea to, let's say, develop or provide the residents with a manual that would help them, for example, in building a partition wall, something that would allow inhabitants to somehow reconquer the possibility over the years to reorganize their space. So I will like just to go very quickly this set of, let's say, drawings that are part of this manual, which I think are self-explanatory, which in fact communicate the easiness of the possibility of transforming your own living space. The manual contains different somehow chapters. I'll just show you the possibility of building an alcove, which is this space that I have presented before, where bed could be contained, and somehow, and again, I think this is quite self-explanatory. So we have, we finally tested all, let's say, these ideas in the two sites that I have presented at the beginning, and I'd like to show you only, let's say, one of these attempts, which in a way concerns the larger plot, which is, let's say, resolve as the coming together of, let's say, a series of, let's say, terrace houses, but rather than being made by the traditional inflexible party wall, are in fact based on, let's say, our service core system, which in fact, differently from, let's say, traditional wall, allow for, let's say, the exploration of the developing of different typologies within the same plot, the possibility of, let's say, enlarging and shrinking of the living space, but also to provide for communal facilities, what you see marked in gray, which in fact span across, let's say, this partition. Few images of, let's say, the facade. This is the facade toward the street, but I'd like to say maybe a few words about the facade towards the back, through which, in fact, accessibility or access to this living unit takes place, which is, again, an attempt to go beyond the idea of the traditional front door of the terrace house, which is in fact a device, a special device that in a way is used to identify very strongly the idea of private property. And contrary to that, we have in fact placed doors in the back, and we have imagined actually the space of accessibility as a space of, let's say, encounter, as a space from which somehow entering the home is not only something, let's say, technical space, but in fact is a space where the distinction between, in a way, what is private and what is public is, let's say, somehow blur. Show you a few images of, let's say, the interior with, let's say, the raw timber surfaces, which, although quite raw, could probably be inhabited as they are. Furniture, as you can see, is clearly, in the case of the alcove, is somehow part of, let's say, the architecture of the homes. In this case, two alcoves for children, a living room with a kitchen, a transparent wall that would separate the house into halves, or the space into halves, allowing for light to come through. A few details. The second project that I'd like to show in the remaining few minutes, and I'll try to be very quick, is a project that it's a very similar experience to this first project. It's a project that we developed for London when we have been approached by a young housing cooperative called Sun Co-op, which in fact was looking for the possibility of developing a building where, let's say, the member of the cooperative, which were mostly, let's say, young people, young workers of the city, could come and, let's say, live together. It's a project that was quite interesting for us because it allowed us to work on the city of London, which is perhaps one of the cities where the housing crisis is at the highest level. And despite it is a city where the consequences of, let's say, the process of privatization, which I talked about at the beginning, are perhaps experienced today at the highest level, it's also a city where there is a lot of public land, an account of which can be publicly consulted through an online database, which in fact point out all, let's say, these plot of land which are in the hand of, let's say, public authorities. And through discussion with the member of the cooperative, we understood how they understood, let's say, their idea of living together, which was really based on, let's say, a gradient between, let's say, individual and communal, exemplified in a certain way in, let's say, the shifting from, let's say, the private space into, let's say, something that was seen as a communal and multifunctional space, where the housing is seen as, let's say, a combination of individual living space, but at the same time also, let's say, part of a larger community made of the neighborhood, the city, and let's say even beyond that. It was very important for us to understand actually what a housing cooperative is and how it works, and to understand, let's say, the rules that are needed in order to, let's say, form a cooperative, to understand actually its network of support upon which a cooperative is able, let's say, to work and to, let's say, develop their own housing aspiration. It was important to understand how the process of land acquisition, which is perhaps the most important process, can, let's say, be developed through either purchase of land from the private market or by leasing land from public authorities, but also to understand what would be, let's say, at the end, somehow the more programmatic dimension of the project, which was a combination of residential unit where the member of the cooperative would live, a series of what we could call non-residential function that could be at service of the inhabitants, but also, let's say, open to the city, and a percentage of social housing, what in UK is called council housing, which was something that was needed in order to profit by a certain somehow support that was seen necessary in order to allow for the cooperative to develop. Similarly to the previous project, we have initiated our work by searching for sites according to, let's say, certain category. We have screened them according to, let's say, certain parameters which were discussed together with the cooperative. And again, in this case, we somehow have come up with a series of plot up, and we have actually selected 3 of them, which were identified as, let's say, interesting plot because, in fact, would all somehow be, on the one hand, exemplary of the plot that would be available in London for developing such a project, but also plot that would, let's say, be well fit to accommodate a housing for about 14 people. But having plot that, as you can see from this footprint, are so different, in a way impose us to understand a way to tackle this project, which was perhaps differently from the way in which such a project would be normally tackled. So rather than actually starting from the idea of the building, we actually really start from the idea of the living cell, of the individual, let's say, room, which was meant to be a room for one person, a room made of a toilet with a small working space and sleeping space, storage space, and a part of, let's say, the distribution space. An idea that, or a space which in fact represent an embodiment, or which embody Karel Teige diagram that appear in his book of 1932 on the minimum dwelling, where in fact he understood minimum dwelling not an individual living cell, but an individual living cell which is meant to be somehow supported by a series of collectivized and, let's say, shared facilities. And while the cells are, let's say, all the same, their aggregation can give form to, let's say, different types of social association, such as a small unit for, let's say, two people living together, but also eventually become a larger single bedroom with a larger, let's say, parlor-like space where, for example, working activities could be performed, but eventually could also become something, let's say, more traditional, to a set of, let's say, two bedrooms. A small, actually, a duplex with a little alcove on the upper floor when, in fact, the upper floor could be built. But could also unfold into, let's say, more independent type of household, such as a studio as equipped with a small kitchen, or a more traditional let's say, two-bedroom apartment, or a three-bedroom apartment with its own individual kitchen, or, for example, two different independent apartments which would share a larger kitchen place in the middle. The structure we had to come about is very simple. It was actually, we had to develop a structure that in a way could support and accommodate all the sort of typology that I have just presented. And we understood that we needed in a way to develop something that indeed was simple, so that these topology could be accommodated, but also something that potentially could be self-built by the member of the cooperative, since in fact this was one of the requests of that was in fact posed to us. So what you see is actually in a way very simple traditional structure built in timber, also in this case, where again all the facilities of the house are concentrated within this sort of central spine, which is what you see highlighted in green in this scheme. A section, a technical sort of sections, and you can clearly see how, in fact, technical equipment are all concentrated and easily accessible in order to facilitate also, for example, issue of maintenance. Also, in this case, we develop a series of aggregation that would be able to be, let's say, fit to a different site. Actually, we had three different, let's say, typologies. The first one is the one on top, which is, let's say, a solution that would be adapted to work on in linear long site, where in fact collective facilities, what you see in white, would be placed in between, let's say, the private space. We had the typology where the same idea was actually transformed, and for more, let's say, regular site, where we have the two edges, two parallel bars of, let's say, private space, and at the center collective space, and what you see in the lower part, a linear, let's say, but a typology, but with shared facilities developed along the main part of the building. The sections, and I'd like to just show one of these possibilities, since in a way each of them share many characteristics, which is in a way the one for more regular plot. You can see the section, you can see actually the plan, where you can see how, in a way, the rigidity of a private space, which is located on the edge, along the edges of the building, is somehow counterbalanced by certain flexibility, which is somehow devised for the central space, which is this part that can be also open to the city. So actually some programmatic schemes, and I'd just like to show a few images. The central production space, the sort of workshop-like spaces that is, let's say, open to the city, and which is flanked and with a more secluded and, let's say, private living space. And another images, the elevation actually toward the city, which is more regular, where in fact the one which is more private becomes more transparent and let's say a sort of veranda-like space, where workshop and living room are contained, and which also allow for let's say the blurring of the distinction between in a way living and working, something that is generally very difficult to achieve within a domestic space. Again, we were interested in providing something, an architecture which contain its own furniture. So where furniture is an important aspect of a domestic landscape, where cabinet, table, bed are somehow integral part of the very architecture of the home. I'd like to conclude by showing in a way the application of this strategy to a larger variety of sites in London. And
Martino, 2 minutes to end, yes. Please.
In 1 minute I'm finished. And when actually I'm showing these images without really commenting on them, I'd like just to record that somehow the reason of this project, which is certainly to suggest the possibility of reform domestic space, but understanding how actually this goal is difficult to achieve, because on the one hand, domestic habits are very difficult to be changed, but also because housing is somehow a special system which is linked with very strict social and juridical frameworks with law and regulation that are in fact strictly defined and very difficult to change. And for this reason, it's not actually enough to advance new typologies, but in fact to reconnect these with, let's say, issues such as ownership and constructions, which in fact to promote something that a process of, let's say, transformation that certainly can be bottom-up, but that in fact it also need to be supported at the state level, where in fact a possibility to rethink, for example, the way in which property right are used need to be, let's say, conceived. And in such a way, I think that, or we think that affordable housing can, let's say, be offered in large quantity and possibly become, in a way, what it should be, in other words, a universal right. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martino, for this precise presentation. I will now introduce Roger to continue with the second presentation. Roger Tudó is co-founder of the architecture studio Harquitectes, established in 2000 in Sabadell, Barcelona, with 4 partners, David Lorente, Josep Ricard, Xavier Ros, and Roger. All partners studied at the Escola Técnica Superior de Arquitectura del Vallès, where both Josep and Roger teach projects and construction. Xavier also teaches projects at the Escola Técnica Superior de Arquitectura de Barcelona. So during the last decade, Harquitectes have been working on this relationship between energy, sustainability, and building as a coherent whole, which is something very, very specific and particular in the contemporary panorama. So welcome, Roger. It's a pleasure to meet you again.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you for inviting us. I will start with a presentation, which is not easy with this software. Sorry. Okay, I think I'm in. So today I will try to talk about this idea, which is not something that is probably a possible idea. It's just something that we are searching about. Is the idea of some kind of architecture without status, and this is trying to look for an architecture that is not exactly defined by these typical preconditions related to the social status or maybe the economical status, or sometimes also related to some kind of cultural status, or even maybe a political status. It's trying to avoid a little bit, as much as possible, this kind of influences that are always there, but we're trying to keep it a little bit away from the design process and try to take a different direction, searching for another quality of architecture that maybe it's more open to everybody, trying to produce a kind of spaces with other kind of attributes, and probably where a lot of people can feel comfortable. And finally, just this idea of trying to avoid this idea of that the architecture is trying to represent some kind of status precondition thing that was just there, the kind of social invention that it's around buildings and clients. So I'll try to expose this in different strategies or approaches. The first one, it's this idea of coming from elemental to fundamental. This is a very simple idea. We really like to work with very basic elements, like the simple ones like walls, doors, windows, roofs, very simple ones. And when these elements are starting to do more than one contribution, they are starting to have an holistic performance in the building. They finally become fundamental. So this idea of how to reduce the number of basic elements and how these elements can improve to fundamental because they are making more contributions. So this is quite clear in this house that we did some time ago. It's a very low budget house. It's in a very specific plot. It's a triangular plot. And that's why the house is finally also triangular, because it's just trying to occupy all the footprint as possible, just taking the minimum distance from neighborhoods. And the house, it's a very simple solution. It's just defining a variety of rooms, and these rooms are divided by structural walls. And basically, this structure, it's everything in the house. It's becoming fundamental because you cannot remove these walls. These spaces are very clearly defined by structure. You can understand that this is a real structure because you can feel that it's real, that you can feel probably gravity inside. You feel the bricks and the definition of the space. It's very clear, and just opening doors and windows, the house, it's already done. So apart from this structural capacity, we also discovered this very amazing capacity of the structural walls and clay with bricks to have a contribution to the climatic conditions of the house. So the structure is not only dividing spaces, it's not only standing the building, it's also like a kind of radiator that it's keeping the heat storage inside. So it's helping and contribution in terms of bioclimatics. And the house, it's just this very, very simple use of the minimum elements with a very simple details. The facade is a kind of, it's the same brick as inside, but just twisted, creating a ventilated facade. And nothing else, just a structure becoming something more fundamental. So another possibility strategy to this idea of trying to produce some kind of architecture without status, it's the idea of the building the previous. It's the idea of trying to design something that it's a little bit before that what it was supposed to be. So that could be just some kind of space that it's before coming inside, or it's maybe some kind of unfinished condition of the space, something that it's not exactly completed or not exactly at the end of your idea of what you were searching in this building. So in this case, in this student building, it's a kind of residence for students. We decide to build this with this element. It's a kind of a three-dimensional concrete element that it's produced in a factory, a kind of very industrialized process. Usually it's finished by other materials, and then when it's already done and finished with all the systems and doors and everything, windows, then it's put it in the plot. So this idea of peeling was very attractive for us, and we understood this as another kind of brick or another kind of big stone. And with these elements, we built some kind of walls, and instead of building one only and higher building, we try to go as low as possible, try to place the units next to the ground, and creating this kind of a double wall that was offering the possibility of an extra space in between. And this space is probably what it's connected with this idea of the previous. So it's a kind of previous space, a kind of maybe a kind of claustro. In fact, this is a little bit like a monastery. There is students working in a very small rooms, sharing probably this room with other students. So we really believe that they maybe were expecting for a little bit of communal space. So the idea is that they have this huge garden in the middle, and this previous condition before you go to your home, or this previous condition when you are living, or maybe the space where you just sharing with other students. So it's this kind of patio inside. The patio is divided in 3 small clausters, producing like 3 different communities. So finally it's 1,000 square meters for free that were not in the original competition. But at the same time, there is also this idea of the previous condition. So the building from inside in this facade, it's something that it looks like not finished. You can see all the systems and all the construction systems. It's something that it looks like if it's still waiting for the final definition of the space. So for us, this idea of something that it's not already defined, it's very important, instead of going against what it's supposed to be, or this idea of the status. So these good microclimatic conditions are obviously helping to the indoor, and people it's using this space in a very free way. So when you come inside the unit, that it's a very basic element, you see just this original structure with no finishing materials, again trying to take advantage of the contribution of the thermal mass. And you you probably feel in this very special atmosphere because you are between the garden in the middle and this kind of vertical garden. There is the facade, there is this kind of plants that are protecting from the sun, and during the winter the leaves are falling. So that was the beginning of the building. Then there is a kind of water tanks on the roof that are irrigation, producing a kind of irrigation system that makes possible that the plants are growing. And the plants for us are also very important in terms of this deconstruction of what is supposed to be a building. So that the building, it's more or less like this now. It's full of plants and it's a little bit disappearing and covered by plants, and in probably this condition of the plants are helping a lot to produce this non-status condition. Another important point is maybe the most important point. It's this idea of the redefinition of what is really valuable in architecture. So for us, it's finally very easy. It's just to produce pleasant spaces, things where people can feel well. The idea of well-being, it's very simple, but it's very difficult to get into this. So this redefinition of what is important, we think that it's usually going against the idea of what is pre-established as the status quo. So we are fighting a little bit against that, trying to search for something a little bit more primordial, probably. So this is a house in Sant Cugat. It's a quite rich area. This is a good parcel. So the problem of this house was the typical situation where the garden was going to be divided in two parts, the south and the north. So we discovered that the really important thing was how this house is going to enjoy everything, all the garden at the same time. So we defined these two qualities. There's going to be a kind of more domestic spaces defined by structural walls, where are the bedrooms, kitchen, and other spaces. And then in between, there is another quality of the space, where is the living room and a kind of dining room and the entry, that it's very connected to the garden. So there is a kind of glass system that can be open 100%, and this space is becoming a kind of porch, producing this kind of condition. So for us, this is what is the important redefinition in this project. This is the really important space where you really feel comfortable, and where you have the real sensation of being in a special place. So everything it's directed to searching for this very, very, very primordial condition, where mostly everybody can easily understand that this is going to be a good place to stay. This is going to be a pleasant situation. So the house, it's just mixing these two qualities. There is the rooms with the same very, very simple construction, again with the cheapest brick and the cheapest horizontal structure, but just painting in white and with this wood windows. It's becoming a little bit more domestic. Or the kitchen, that it's starting to be a little bit more emotional with this extra high, but it's still very domestic. But then you start to realize that there is something there, that it's not painted in white, with a little bit more of natural light, and it's connecting you to this specific place, that it's a redefinition of what it's supposed to be a living room. You feel really outside. Everything it's naked with a very raw material. It's this family don't have economical problems, but they accept this very radical idea of being surrounded by the cheapest materials. But finally, it's working really well. You feel connected. You feel next to the wild. You have a real sensation to be connected to something that it's probably more important than everything, that you feel alive, you feel next to the outdoor condition. So that's working really well. There is also this living room, this dining room where that's a symmetrical condition, and that's the house from outside. So the next idea, it's very connected again with that. It's the idea of because of the interactions of natural phenomena, we are trying to look for a link or a kind of dialogue between nature and building. And when this is happening, there's something extra, a kind of emotional transformation in the experience, that it's helping a lot to focus in things that maybe are not exactly predefined by this status quo. It's searching for something that it's a little bit more convincing, and it's maybe because it's connecting with a bigger phenomena. So this is another house. This is in a historical center. It's between neighborhoods, but with a very particular plot. It's a very large plot connecting two different streets. So the idea of the house, it's very simple, just introducing several conditions, like a sequence of different rooms with a range of thermal conditions and a range of different dimension and proportions. So you have like a long sequence of different qualities. Sometimes you are in a kind of patio that could be a bioclimatic patio, then you are in a regular kitchen or a living room, then you are in an complete outdoor room that is a garden, then a kind of porch, then another patio. At the end, a kind of a super tall garage for the cars. So this sequence, it's starting with this pre-existing facade that we decided to keep it because it was quite nice. And when you cross this, you found this first space that it's clearly this idea that I was explaining before of the previous space. It's, you are not still inside the house, but you are expecting something, and probably you are in the most interesting space, because the quality of this precondition, it's maybe more exciting in terms of architecture experience than a domestic space. And again, here the idea of the interaction of bigger natural phenomena are very important. So these walls are not only explaining variety of bricks that you can see here, there is also explaining how light it's coming from up to down. And this big natural phenomena, I think it's producing the real quality of this space. But at the same time, because of these different dimensions of the bricks, and because of the density of these bricks, because I will explain later that there is a kind of degree of density of the bricks that are relating all this position with the real structure behavior of these walls, and at the same time it's connecting with this other bigger phenomena that it's gravity. So there's a condition here that you really feel this natural light, this gravity, and you feel connected with this other bigger phenomena, and probably other approaches are forgotten because of that. So then inside, it's happening that this patio, it's providing a lot of quality and a nice atmosphere here. And in the patio, you realize again these different levels of bricks that are working like that. There is a kind of distribution where the most massive and smaller bricks are on the bottom, where there is a lot of compression. And when you are going up, the bricks are starting to be lighter and with more holes. So there is a distribution related to the real weight and structural stress. But at the same time, this is combined with a kind of post-tensed beams that are made with bricks. So using the same elements, just with this kind of screws and a kind of iron elements inside, we are producing a combination of bricks that are really connected to what is happening. So it's in some way it's producing this idea of that the invisible, it's becoming visible. So this structural behavior, this gravity effect, it's becoming visible. And when this is happening, there's kind of a emotional awakening that it's starting to probably forgot all these other conditions about the status and the representation of what it means, a building. And the next strategy, it's the idea of belonging. So usually, and I think Martino was talking about before, the idea of what is belonging. It's also always very related to the idea of property. So usually we understand the buildings belongs to the clients, or maybe belongs to the designer, or maybe there is a kind of extended idea of property. But in this case, I think that that all these things are connected with the idea of a status. The idea of non-status architecture is searching for another idea of belonging, that it's related to the real place, to the real site of the building, that it's something that probably it's a little bit more autonomous from the status. And in this case, this is another house that it's in a very beautiful village. This is maybe it looks like an existing wall, but it's a completely new wall. It starts with these pre-existing walls. That this is in Ullastret. This is a very ancient village where all the walls are made with this kind of a stone facades. Sometimes there are houses, sometimes there are just party walls that are protecting the gardens and some kind of agriculture paths. So all the village is done with this technology. So we found a wall like that in our plot, but for a strange reason, the urban conditions were not allowing to maintain this wall. We should demolish this wall and to reduce the plot in order to make a bigger street, which is quite a stupid thing in this village, but we had to do it. So the idea is that we found this existing wall, and we didn't want to lose this quality, so we redesigned a new house that it's producing a new wall, reusing the stones from the original wall, and this idea is the belonging. So how the house can really belongs to the plot instead of belonging to other aspects more related to the status quo. So that because it belongs to the idea of the place and the idea of the reconstruction of a wall, the house, it's quite strange. It's really forced as a typological element. It's very large. It's more large, much more larger than usual. So it's extending until it's closing all the plot. So then the house is again a sequence of rooms, but in this case the rooms are very close to the street in order to reproduce this very massive idea of the stone wall, but it's very open on the garden, and there is a very clear sequence that it's producing a very radical typological way of living. There is a more conventional day area with kitchen and dining room and living room, and then the rooms, if you want to go to your room, maybe you have to cross in front of the room of the other members of the family. So it's a kind of gallery connecting all the rooms. There is a little bit more conventional room at the end, but all this elements in between are porches. So if you want to go from the kitchen to your bed, you have to across exterior spaces. So it's quite radical. And this is built just reusing this belonging materials. So the idea of reusing the stones, obviously, but also some parts of local earth, and also mixing this with a kind of a recycled glass isolation that it's in between this kind of mortar, that it's joining everything. So finally, it's a kind of contemporary concrete that it's just instead of using cement, it's using lime and mixed with earth and stones. So the stones are having a strange distribution. It's a little bit like a rameter construction made with different layers, but it's not exactly rameter, it's lime. And the distribution of the stones, it's also producing different locations inside. So depending if we want to have an isolation facade, we are not introducing stones. When we are connected to the outside and we want this contextual approach to the other houses, the stones are only outside, so you still have a lot of isolation. And when you are inside, like in these walls that are black on this plan, it's full of stones because we need a lot of inertia inside. We want to keep the temperature inside. So finally, it's something like that it really looks like an existing wall, because it's a framework, but we finally make us a demolition of the surface in order to discover the stones inside. But from the other side, it's this very contemporary architecture, kind of a vernacular contemporary. Everything can be open 100%. It's like a big porch with a lot of quality again. So you are living here and you feel outside and very protected. And with all these qualities, you are surrounded by matter, and the matter, it's keeping the temperature, it's giving a good humidity regulation. So the qualities are not only visual qualities, everything is linked with this kind of invisible elements that are in between. This is me and some of my people of the office having lunch here. It's a really pleasant place. And this is the gallery, the sequence that it's crossing the rooms, and the rooms are these quite radical systems with bathrooms, and you are sleeping like in a cave. But it's really working very well, and the clients are really happy here. So from outside, it's again this very radical condition and this very convincing materiality that it's really belonging to the place. Now it's a little bit wide, but by the time it's going to be like that, so it's really connected to the contextual. And for the last concept, it's the idea of the luxury of the common matter. So this idea is very connected to what I have been explaining right now. It's the idea that maybe the one possibility of going against the pre-established status conditions is to build with something that it's really a common matter, that it's things like air, that it's just between us, and it has no property. Air is everywhere. You just have to open the window and you have it inside. Things like sun radiation, that it's right now it's not a private property or a cultural quality. It's for everyone. Things like the breeze, things like the temperature, very simple things that are probably producing a common matter, that if the architects, we are able to design this common material, maybe we have the possibility to produce something more affordable. In this case, it's a social housing project that we are building right now. It's quite a big plot with quite a big building. The urban condition was already designed, so our first decision, it was a small gap that was possible to just to produce some empty spaces or some geometries in the facade, some regulations, but we decided to occupy all the footprint and to use this gap to produce a kind of patio inside. So this is the conventional solution. So our idea was to produce this small patio inside, but that was providing a lot of quality here, because you are easily connecting with this luxury of the common material. You are connected to natural light, connected to the move of the wind. You are connected to this natural phenomena. So the building, it's quite radical in terms of typology, because it's producing a two really narrow. So instead of one building, we have two very, very narrow buildings with a kind of balconies and corridors inside. So in plan, you can see it's a kind of a very large line of rooms with equal dimension. These rooms are connected by a corridor, indoor corridor, but it's working like a gallery, and it's trying to produce a confusion between this corridor and this balcony, that it's also like another corridor connecting everything, but obviously there is division. So these are very basic rooms, and the bathrooms and the corridors are producing a kind of gallery. You can see here a little bit more detail. This is very defined by the structure. The structure, it's this grid of equal rooms. One room is the kitchen, another is the living room. In this case, it's connected, and then you have two other, or sometimes three rooms, and you have this bathroom that it's becoming in an extension of this big corridor, and this big corridor, it's producing something like that. So you have the room defined by the structure with these connections, and you feel between two kind of exteriors. One is on your left, it's a real exterior, it's a balcony, but on your right, it's just an indoor corridor, a conventional corridor, but because it's transformed in terms of this interaction with natural phenomena, and it's improving this kind of new luxury, that it's this natural light, this air moving, this temperature, and these different attributes, because it's naked, because you feel that you are not inside, and a little bit you are against this pre-established status that a corridor is just a functional thing. This is going to a little bit more emotional dimension. So it's still something connecting functions, but it's something else than function. It's something that connects with these other qualities. And this is the very clear definition. This is indoor, but it feels like outdoor. This is outdoor, and this is the clear definition, and you feel surrounded by this amount of luxury. And this is the building from outside, and this is the place that it's also such a little bit luxury, because it has views from the sea, and it's quite a nice surrounding, and it's just under construction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. We will now have a short break, only 2 minutes, and we will come back with our dialogue. For the audience, please start working on your questions, ideally for both practices, for both authors, and not only for one. You can leave them in the chat. Time is already running, so see you in 2 minutes. Hello again. As you might imagine, we have plenty of questions. I'm probably not the only one confirming the strong relationship in between both approaches, both Arquitectes and Dogma, and this potential of the architecture without the status. So perhaps we can start the dialogue. I have a couple of questions to open the dialogue. And well, first of all, thank you again. Now I see you both. Thank you, Roger and Martino, for this great presentation. I have many issues to discuss, so hopefully we will start one. I will just start. It's about the synthesis of the program. I will say that both practices try to radically synthesize program in favor of a space that in some cases is even understood not only in square meters, actually. By doing this, you come to new proportions and relationships between programs. For example, Martino, you already introduced this idea of the inhabitable wall, somehow avoiding prefigured solutions or impositions. And for example, you have been working with this idea as well, Roger. So, but this is a kind of fundamental issue in the context of collective housing. We have the hierarchies and rigidity we found in the current housing offer. Also, the difficulties to develop alternative solutions in both real estate and social housing contexts. You somehow, Martino, you already talked a little bit about it. So it seems that both market and institutions are perhaps too attached to their own standards and extremely slow in embracing alternative way of living and evolution. So first question will be, which are your thoughts on it, on this? Which is your experience dealing with public clients on this type of questions? Can you share some ideas regarding this? For example, Roger, I'm personally curious about the solution you introduced in the last project, having all the let's say the rooms within these two, having the same dimension, the same proportion, let's say, in between these two exteriors, in between spaces, let's say.
No, that was a quite simple idea, but it works. I think that the idea of equivalent rooms, it's not obviously our idea. All the tradition, it's full of this, especially when buildings were built with masonry structural walls. Then it was very clear the most of the traditional. I think that everything changed with the concrete, but before concrete and before the fossil area, when everything was much more difficult and much more local as a research, everything was defined by walls, and the most of the typologies are reproducing equal rooms. This is not an invention, but what it's maybe a little bit more invention is the idea of producing a line, just one room, in order to be very in touch with the environment. And this is a very simple, it's a kind of a makeup, because it's just transforming the traditional corridor in something that it doesn't look like. It's just providing light and finishing the materials. You get this transformation. It's very simple, and it's been not difficult for the client, because it's in fact it's except maybe they don't always do equivalent rooms, but the typology, it's a very standard typology. It's just a corridor and rooms. But because of the patio and these extra qualities and this extra dimension of the corridor that can allow something else to happen, it's working perfectly. It's very simple. I don't know. It has been no problems with. We've been with, obviously, with other discussions maybe with the client, but not this. They have seen this very client. It's a public client, so they have a kind of ethical position, a kind of kind of responsibility. So it's not a private client in this case, but I think it's very easy to understand, and they have understand it very, very easy.
Okay. Please, Martin, perhaps, yeah.
Well, I like a lot, I have to say, this last project, and also the explanation that was given. And in a way, it tells me that somehow, I think what Roger just said, that at the end, it's a project that to me looks very different, to be honest. I was about to pose the same question that you posed, Felipe, but in a way, yeah, I think that in a way a corridor which is in fact not a corridor anymore, because in fact it has all of a different set of qualities. Rooms which have certain proportions, which are still rooms, but in fact they don't look like traditional social housing rooms. Perhaps that is in a way the strategy to probably reform very strictly predefined notion of what actually small dwelling is. So I found that actually a very, let's say, interesting and inspiring, let's say, strategy to deal with. I would say that, in fact, in our case, we have actually faced this issue of, we faced together, especially in the project of Brussels, which in any way had to confront with, let's say, the issue of regulation more directly. We have actually faced a struggle there. We have faced a struggle between, of course, us as architect, which has a certain ambition, a client, or let's say a partner in the game that had also somehow understood that maybe it's important to, let's say, go, let's say, beyond very, let's say, predefined typology, which at least in Belgium are very strongly dictated by regulations. And in a way, our project was indeed actually meant to challenge that. We had a series of workshops also with planning authorities in order to see actually what were the issues. They were all, let's say, open to the discussion, not that, this was a study, so there was not, let's say, implementation that, but certainly it will not be implementable as it is. Because of, for example, circulation, accessibility, this accessibility on the back with this sort of balcony, something that in open air would not be possible. Certainly the idea, for example, the idea of the alcove, everybody was very interested, but would not be, let's say, something that could be achievable right away. But I think that in a way what is interesting is that the project was seen as, let's say, a tool to somehow test something and to push and to, in a way, initiate a discussion that, in a way, I felt that among many parties was somehow seen as something that is somehow needed. So, in a way, I think that in that regard, nonetheless, the exercise was not useless.
No, I totally understand, and actually for Roger it seems a little bit obvious, let's say, but for us seeing the project, it's actually not obvious at all. Let's say this understanding by the clients, or let's say, because of course we understand the project, we are architects, let's say. So, but this is related with the second question actually, and it's related to this idea of the in-between as a project actually, that both practices are also dealing with things quite long in several projects. So it is quite interesting how both of you have embraced the in-between condition, greenhouses, open galleries, and so on and so forth. There is a huge tradition on this subject, this is clear. For example, in the words of Chilean architect Glenda Kapstein, from a book published in the 88, regarding the in-between space, she stated, "It is constituted in a place that can be a reflection of the life of its occupants and where they can be as free as in a controlled interior, but incorporating the natural elements, sun, wind, rain, and landscape from a small world that is possible to order, transform, and tame." Of course, this idea of the in-between as an extra space, as Lacaton and Basal suggest, there are many other possibilities, an unsolicited space, a space of life and freedom, a space that could be a compensation or understood as a kind of added spatial value. While it is not useless, it is nonetheless free of the utility. So I will try to, I will be interested, we are interested actually to talk again about this in-between condition, which is appearing insistently in most of your projects and with different formats and proportions and conditions. Can you talk a little bit about it?
I can start. I mean, maybe we can have an exchange about it. I think that yes, I see that, and I have also touched upon in my presentation. I think that in a way, one of the, let's say, goal or let's say ambition of our work on the house is exactly to somehow go beyond certain, let's say, strict definitions, boundaries, sort of dichotomic logic between, opposition, for example, living, what is working, what is public, what is private, which in a way are very much, say, driven, I would say, especially in the 20th century, the idea of the home. And the idea of domestic space in general. So, of course, in the moment that you try to bypass that or try to break that, in a way, you also have to come about with somehow idea of space that, in a way, I think is a sort of embodiment of that. And this, I think, what you call in between, or what we have, let's say, seen, of course, in different declensions, I think. I would say basically nearly all of the projects that Roger has showed. It's, I think, an attempt to exactly embody that goal that we feel is, let's say, very relevant. I think that perhaps dealing with, let's say, perhaps harsher climatic condition, in our case, it has not. It has some, let's say, limitations, but I think that in a way, the appearing of this in between is exactly, let's say, the outcome of let's say, at least for us, of this goal.
In my point of view, I obviously agree in this idea of the in between, but. I think that compared to Lacaton and Basal, that we are obviously we are really interested on them, but I think they are doing something different. Usually, that they are extending, they are producing an extra space. So this in between, it's something additional. And I think that in our work, sometimes it's like this, but not always. And what I have found really interesting in Martino's proposal, especially the second one with the London one, with this kind of programmatic in between condition. That for me it's a little bit like Louis Kahn when he was defining this idea of the kind of space that it's defining the institution. So I think that these spaces, this kind of workshop and all this, it's a kind of an extra attribute that it's really defining this building. It's not only housing. And I think in a certain way, when we are making a redefinition of what is a corridor or what is a living room, it's a little bit the same. It's not just an extra space in between, something added. No, it's something that it's the nuclear condition of it's something that it's the principal space. And sometimes in Lacaton Basal it's always like that, but I think it's always more something that it's extended, which is also a good quality, but it's different, I think, from what we are doing. And I think, especially in this second project, I think that Martino, it's also, I think it's talking about that, the importance of something else that's happening there.
Yeah, I think that yes, I think that
it's not only freedom. It's not only freedom. It's something else.
It's not a next kind of an enlargement. It becomes something more constitutional of, let's say, actually the space where a certain idea of living is really, let's say, defined.
Actually, you are both right, because let's say of course, Lacaton and Basal have introduced this idea of extra space within the private realm, and actually we want to talk about the potential regarding collective housing as a really fundamental device for building a community. So last question before to leave Diana start also with her own questions, and then opening the debate with the public. It is related to the sizes of community actually, or even before the existence of a community. That's something is quite relevant. With all the good things it brought, perhaps one of the failures of the built examples during the modern period was not the right tuning. Big slabs that try to be strategic in dealing with the density demands and land available, but less sensible about the scale and how communities work and recognize themselves actually. To understand the size and specific character of communities or sub-communities seems fundamental to ensure the success of collective housing in time. Actually, this is very well known, and you both actually, I really appreciate that you both introduced this type of idea of communities. For example, do you hear me when you sleep? It's a community of around 40 people, and for example, the housing for the students in the SAF are 47 apartments, and they are already a community, so they have something to share already. So do you have a specific position regarding this issue, which is quite challenging? It's about also, it's a kind of cultural problem to the possibility actually to contribute to the creation of community or the reinforcement of community through architecture and not neglect this community? Can you share a little bit?
Well, I don't know. I think that I don't know if there is, let's say, a size recipe. I mean, I understand, let's say, for sure, in a way, the project, but they're smaller somehow. But they're also smaller because, at least in our case, the initiative with which we have, let's say, been working have always somehow had some certain limitations, which and the work actually the scale, which is not the scale of the public as let's say more generally intended. But having also, let's say, dealt with the issue of the slabs and the modern social dwelling, I think that in many cases, let's say, of course, there was a problem of sheer size. But there was also, let's say, an issue that had really to do with somehow the typological definition of this dwelling. So, which is really has to do with the scale of the unit, because in fact, exactly those, for example, in between space are often completely absent. You have traditionally, basically the vertical circulation, the smallest possible corridor and that's really a corridor to your living unit, and actually the ground is a completely, let's say, sort of undefined sort of public realm that nobody really feels capable of appropriating. There is then the type of the residential unit themselves, which were very much based on this idea of the traditional 3 to 1 room family apartment, which as I was trying to say, really somehow reinforced this aspiration towards the kind of middle class typical dwelling. So to me, let's say this is for sure an issue of scale, because of course with scale you have a problem enlarge and become more difficult. But I think there was some more, I don't know, maybe hidden issue that are still perhaps not really fully recognized, that in a way make actually that forms of community not able to somehow really, let's say, emerge.
Yeah, maybe I will add something that it's or maybe also connected of what we were talking before, that it's I think that to become collective, there is this idea of the previous that I was explaining. I think it's very important, because the extra qualities that you are introducing to the buildings, if they are, for example, if you have a communal, if you have an extra space, but this extra space, it's not private, it's something that you found when you enter to the building, it's very different, that it's a final space that you can only enjoy by yourself or with your family. So this, the same square meters, and the dialogue between privacy and collective, it's very important. So again, it's not. I think it's not about extensions. It's about the redefinition of things. And again, for me, the space of the workshop, it's doing this. It's producing the previous condition, that it's the communal condition in this case. And I think also it's very connected to the one of the main ideas that your partner Aurelie is explaining in the possibility of an absolute architect, not the idea of this extension of the public space, that it's coming inside. So how the public space is able to across a property and producing something that is still quite public, but it's not exactly the street. I think that this is very important in terms of the definition of the community, because it's producing a rank that goes from individual and privacy to the totally public space. So the different layers on this intensity, it's I think it's very important.
Now I'm going to start to the questions of the audience by the order that the people asks. So João Gaspar asks, this is a question I think much for architects, for you, Roger. What role spells the client in the chance to work with experimental projects? Do you have unconventional clients, or do you bring unconventional approaches to conventional clients?
Very difficult question. Now, I think that it's both at the same time. Sometimes it's been a strange condition. For example, the first house that I present, an economical condition makes possible that a very standard client accepts something that maybe it's not the more standard things. And sometimes it's by the time we are receiving we have the possibility to work with some maybe kind of a better client in terms of they are more open to other things, and sometimes or some of these houses they are from clients with quite a lot of money, so we have to stop them, and then it's our attitude that it's reducing the budget, and it's trying to go to something more radical and strange. But I think there is a variety of those conditions.
Okay. For you, Martino, I don't know, because in your case it's more specific. But if you want to say something.
I think that well, it varies, of course. But since we have mostly worked, let's say, on the level of, let's say, development of study rather than a real project, so project that in a way have kind of a sort of more perhaps let's say radical or that in a way where the ambition was clearly like trying to challenge maybe the status quo since its very inception. I think that when we did this, we were often, let's say, doing this with, let's say, client or, let's say, partners that in a way share actually the vision. So I think in that sense, I think that, yes, I think it was perhaps a kind of a share. There was a sort of communality of, I don't know if they would have expected what we had developed, but I think the starting point was somehow on the same ground.
It's like a match with you and the organizations. Okay. So another one from Madalena Vidigal, also to Roger. What are the priorities in choosing materials? Do you consider building with raw materials to be a statement, or it also has an economical advantage?
It's a little bit the same. There is some projects like the first one, or the social housing, or maybe even the residence for the students, that some decisions are economical decisions. It's the way that you can establish these priorities. Maybe you reduce something and then you can pay a better window or something like that. And in other cases, it's because of the properties that are giving, maybe it looks like cheap or it looks like raw, but in fact it's because it's producing some kind of a comfort around it, just because this brick, it's keeping this humidity, it's establishing a good thermal relation or something like that. So but maybe it's not for economical decision, it's because it's providing a good contribution to this pleasant condition.
Mm-hmm. But perhaps on this, Roger, actually, because I totally understand the question. Let's say that you have developed already several houses, built houses for many different clients, but Walba is the most perhaps a kind of model within architects. I will say it was of course a summary of different conditions, economic crisis, and so on and so forth, but probably is the most radical as well in dealing with this kind of aesthetic atmosphere, let's say, and really cutting like really everything and using the materials as you already introduced, let's say, exposed structure, electric system visible, and so on and so forth. Let's say when you were introducing again the project, I was coming back. I was thinking actually about this less is enough. Let's say small short essay by Pier Vittorio, talking about this condition, really about how to build the let's say, as Lina Bobardi would say, poor architecture with the maximum dignity and with very few means. Can you perhaps talk, both of you, about these conditions, which is actually it's appearing in both practices, actually, in both Harquitectes and Dogma, this aesthetic type of architecture, if you want to add something to this subject.
No, I understand that maybe you are you like the Hualva house because it's more radical, but I don't know if you can choose to live in one of the others. I don't know which one you will. I don't know. I think it's a very interesting project, a very interesting exercise. It's really a good place to live, and it's really cheap and affordable. So it has this condition and this idea that with only a few things you can feel a good quality. So I understand, but I think that there are other aspects in the other projects that are providing a little bit more extra quality. I don't know, even this simple corridor or other things that I think that are introducing something else that for me it's even maybe more interesting than Hualva. That obviously I like a lot Hualva, and for us was a very important moment in the office to make this radical exercise. But I don't know. I feel more excited by other conditions.
Like Granollers, probably, no?
No,
For
not only
example.
no, and the house in Sant Cugat, and I don't know. I don't. But I think it's for me the Hualva house is still too much related to the object. So it's walls and bricks and geometry, and it's fantastic because I think it's well done, it's well designed, it's the best thing possible in those moments. But for me, it's more interesting the happening, this kind of phenomena, atmospheres, things that are not exactly the object. It's what's happening there, and I think that in the other projects there are more things happening, and there is a little bit more intensity about this happening. That's my point of view.
Could I keep going with another one from Charlene that says, why is it difficult to implement these different typologies of construction? With this question, there are two interpretations. Maybe it's about the practice of architects, but also could be the typology of constructions, could be the typology of housing. I don't know. Let's start. I'm going to use this question to make a bridge relationship with in the case of Portugal, because and to talk about the typologies of housing. Sorry for for Charlene. Sorry if it's for Roger, but Martino, in the last number of Electra magazine, you introduced the cases of the Baugruppen in Berlin and other similar cases, which, although they are very successful in eliminating intermediaries and the quality of the common spaces, etc., but they don't solving the problems of speculative factors of real estate market. And in addition, it also works with credit resource from the participants. Now, thinking about this model, this kind of models for the countries of the south of Europe, like Portugal, it seems that on one hand there are cultural issues, and on the other hand, the financial issues that limit the success of these operations. I think culturally, contrary to what it may seem, we, the people of the South, we are much less predisposed to the community sense, perhaps because we have a more present sense of family in a traditional way, I don't know. But what is certain is that public spaces initiatives, etc., in north of Europe tend to be better received than that in the south. On the other hand, the financial level, and because it's necessary the access to credit, there would be a greater distrust in participating in the initiative, like in countries like Portugal, perhaps because it has a more fragile economy that does not offer much guarantees as the economy of, for example, Germany. In this sense, and using this question, I would like to hear you about this. Think about this. Is that a cultural issue or an economic issue, or it's more like a problem, a global problem, and it's difficult to implement? And then Roger, about the typologies of construction, we could continue.
Well, it's difficult to answer, Diana, to this question. For sure there are strong cultural issues which in fact make certain perhaps initiative easier, or let's say more possible in certain contexts than other. But I would like to, for example, see the condition where we are working on, which is very based in Brussels, and since several years working in Belgium. Belgium is, for example, very traditional. First of all, it's also a Catholic country, but it's also a very traditional country in terms of, let's say, housing situation. It's actually a country where I think it has one of the highest rate of home property in the whole Europe, where there is a very strong sense of the idea of the family home, or the owner or the property home. And even here, I see that, perhaps not as with a certain delay compared to maybe Germany or, for example, Scandinavian country, which has been at the forefront of rethinking the idea of home as a kind of family dwelling. I see that there are transformation going on. So this makes me somehow feeling that okay, these let's say cultural barriers can also be perhaps transcend, and that things can also, let's say, change within different projects. I think that for sure, let's say, these models need to be adapted, and that's why certain countries that are strong cooperative traditions, certain countries like Germany have developed a group recently, but for example, this idea of the syndicate that I've mentioning and with which we have worked in the past. So I don't know. I have the feeling that there is for sure need of a certain cultural and social milieu for that to happen. But I'm also thinking that these are not, let's say, insurmountable barriers somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And then perhaps related to this question, actually, this cultural problem, I will say, perhaps we can come back also to this idea of architecture without status, and to see if there is a kind of bridge in between both practices, because Martino, you were curious about this kind of meaning before the presentation. Roger has been quite clear about, let's say, limiting, let's say, their understanding of the architecture without the status in a very quite clear way, let's say. And then there is a question, of course, about a name, let's say, or a potential that is related, of course, to the reproduction or massiveness of this type of architecture, let's say, because to be honest, let's say, architecture let's say, we could say that architecture has been, of course, really related to a kind of elite, let's say, and is in many cases is both a discipline and product for the upper classes, actually. And this is a very annoying for probably all of us, let's say. Of course, something this is not a big surprise, understanding that many architects we know, many practices we appreciate are coming very from this elite, let's say. So, but then you introduce, Martino, this is something probably quite recent in your own research, and perhaps a bridge in between both practices. It's about really to go into construction and then to really try to develop instruments, mechanisms to help people to actually to develop their own construction, self-building, let's say, perhaps approaching to this to initiatives such as Le Castor in France and so on and so forth. So, what do you think, both of you, sorry, about this potential? Again, both Martino and Roger, do you see that there is something in the end related to the construction and the way we teach others to actually to understand and to deal with architecture besides us as authors? What do you think?
I think that it's quite a different approach. I do believe that what is dogma designing, it's quite close to the idea of architecture without the status, but probably it's more connected to the idea of the use of the space. So it's I think that there is, I can see, but I don't know if it's like this, but from my point of view, I can see in their projects something that it's trying to avoid the pre-established understanding of the use of the space. So there's a kind of radical redefinition on that. And probably this could be connected with this self-construction or self-adaptity to the space, especially on the first project. But at the same time, for me, there's a more open range of possibilities of this idea that obviously are connecting with my personal interest, that it's this idea of connecting with something that it's not it's not exactly related to the human organization. It's so my approach is something that it's trying to go a little bit further than how people is organized, but at the same time I do feel very close to this kind of simple geometrics, simple definitions of things, and potentials that are beyond all these decisions. So I think that there is this connection, but what I was trying to explain is something a little bit extra, that it's apart from that, maybe. I don't know.
I keep going because
I think that Martino wants to say something.
Yes, no, I like to let other people talk about our work. So, but I try to put the two things together, which is not easy. I somehow, I'd say that, until a certain, I would say that this issue of, let's say, materials and construction became, let's say, more present lately in our work. Because before, actually, with this, I don't know if it's without this idea without status, we never use this term, but somehow this attempt to provide something that was, I would say, maybe generic, maybe abstract, or maybe without connotations, was often, at least in our, I would say, work until a certain moment, very much, let's say, associated with the use of, I don't know, industrial material, generic material, prefabricated material, which had, were affordable, we had no kind of stylistic ambition. But in a way that was somehow something that we had always, let's say, look at. In a way, this issue of, to involve or to engage with this issue of construction, and in a way, to provide something that is able to accommodate differences, to accommodate, let's say, different people, to, I don't know, avoid, that is open to everybody, I think, as it was said before. In a way, also brought us, to an encounter with techniques and materials that we never actually had thought of before, and I think it's, but I think it's enriching. I mean, I don't see this as it's very different, I think, from probably certain choices that we would have made maybe a few years ago. But I think it's actually supporting of this, let's say, idea of non-status in the sense of an architecture that is able to, let's say, it's open to everybody, but that in a way can also be used in the literal sense of the term by everybody.
Mm-hmm. For you, Martino, also, do you think the implementation of a national housing service, similar to health services, can have an impact in the housing crisis by providing these services for all? Or do you think the solution resides in particular communities, in community organization that allows experimentation and changes in typologies, social habitats, etc.?
I think I can reply very quickly. I think it has probably been both of them. In a way, I think in the last year there has been a lot of discussion also among architects, or let's say an architectural debate among somehow these, let's say, alternative form of housing which are linked to initiatives, Germany, I don't know, and Switzerland, Scandinavian countries, and now also several in London. But I think there is a limit to those. I mean, I also want to be kind of clear about that, and I think that in a way, this project needs to also somehow engage with, or maybe serves as a platform to rethink the need of maybe sort of larger effort, because I don't think there is the possibility to exactly do what the person that asked the question to somehow become something that is say, universal, because in a way this still remains very niche otherwise. And I think we need to be aware of that.
We have to. So I'm going fast to give the opportunity. What's your opinion about flexible housing theme? It is important for housing architecture. Well, it's more or less like the last we are talking about. But if you want to developing the idea.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the work speak for themselves. Yes, of course, yes, but let's say within. But this is supported by a specific and precise architectural idea, which is not somehow an undefined, let's say, architecture, which can be everything. So to me, somehow this plea towards a flexibility somehow call for actually a sort of clearly defined, architectural space rather than the opposite. So just maybe, but I think that probably is clear by the work that was presented.
Mm-hmm. There's another question about the contribution of the manual labor. Christine asks, Martino, where do you see the idea of owners, inhabitants contributing manual labor going? What are the limits of possibilities? What are the values of that behind economical benefits?
Well, I think, first of all, the economical benefit can be substantial, so I would not, let's say, think that this is not relevant. But I think, and I think, let's say, our work and the project that I show is just perhaps, a hint into that. I'm not saying that, we are, let's say, giving an answer, but I think that there is a lot of potentials because, especially because in a way, construction is about the building, but it's also about the maintaining. It's about, it's a social, can also become a sort of, one of these performance that contribute to the making of a community. So in that respect, that it can have actually an impact that goes pretty much beyond, the economic mean, which nonetheless can be also substantial.
Mm-hmm. Okay. For Roger, could the raw material aesthetic establish itself a new contemporary type of status when it somehow represents an upper middle class Western architecture option?
Yeah, it's obvious that all the aesthetics positions finally are redefining a new status quo. So it's all the things that are reburning are dying, and this is impossible. We are trying to produce things that are that have the qualities to extend the interest on the time, so that they are not going to last in a short period of time. But this is when you are introducing an aesthetical position, that we are, obviously, there is always this danger of something is going to death in some moments. So that's why we are every time more focused on the happening and not on the object. So there is obviously this visual raw materials that are helping also to build these atmospheres, but there is something more strong behind that. It's this behavior that it's a little bit invisible, that it's the things that we are trying to really define, and probably in a few years we will consider that a brick without plaster, it's something boring. So but I hope that the rest of the qualities will resist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, we have to finish. I have a lot of pressure to finish our session, unfortunately, but we want to thank you both, Martino and Roger, for the excellent presentations and reflections on these topics that we consider pertinent to including in that cycle. As we said at the beginning, to present emancipatory ideas that help us to build we understand as a common field. Many thanks to CCB and Lisbon Architecture Trienal, and from the Campo Comum teams, we wish you a Merry Christmas and see you next year, hopefully in person. Bye. Thank you very much.
Ciao,
Bye.
ciao. Thank you very much. See you soon. Ciao, ciao.